I had a client that went to, I'm going to talk eventually in this talk about the role of achievement in building self-esteem, but I had a kid that was really struggling and using, and he went to a wilderness treatment center out in Utah. And he was the first kid I'd sent there, so I wanted to go out and see him during his stay. So I flew out to Salt Lake and rented a car and drove up to see him, and the staff was great, and they said, part of our treatment plan is to keep kids away from their phone, and then we have group, and then they sleep under the stars and build fires and all this stuff. And he said, we're starting to think that we could scrap the fires and scrap the camping and scrap the group and just take their phones away and they'll get better. It was really interesting. So, well, this is a two-part talk on technology and self-esteem, and I'm going to touch a little bit on how they're related. And I'm going to try to simplify this in a way that I hope you'll never forget. I've tried it, this is a complex thing, but I want you to understand it in a way that you'll take home. You don't need notes. You'll never forget this. So we'll get to that part in a minute. This is the topic that I'm most asked to speak about, and the topic that I most don't like to talk about. And the reason I don't like to talk about it is because by the time I get to the 10th or 12th statistic, I see people's eyes glaze over. They start hearing how many billions of dollars are spent on pornography and how many kids play Fortnite. And after a while, the data is just overwhelming. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit. But then I want to talk more, because you can look that up. I mean, you can Google it or go on YouTube or something and see what the data is saying about it. But the truth is, we don't know how bad technology is, because everybody in this room didn't grow up with a smartphone. Even my kids, who are early 30s now, they had cell phones, but they didn't have smartphones. So the kids that are growing up now, the kids that are 11, 12, 13, we don't know what it's doing to their brain. We can only guess. So my thought is that it's quite dangerous, but not for some of the reasons you typically hear about. We don't know what effect it's having on kids' brains, and we won't know that for some time. I wonder sometimes if there'll ever be a pendulum swing, if there'll ever be a mass movement to dump technology, to go off into the wilderness. Anything can hit a tipping point and things can go viral really fast. And we have a small unheated one-room cabin up in Canada, and for 15 years now, or 10 years with smartphones, I brought kids up there, and there's no reception at all. So the first 2 days, they're going like that. And over and over and over again, these kids are mostly kids that are friends of my kids, and we come back to civilization. It's a 45-minute boat ride to get to the closest place that I can get my car. And I say, how was the trip? What did you like the most? And over again, they say, being unplugged. So even though that was what they liked the most, by the time we drive to the first Dairy Queen on their way back, they're texting like crazy. I have a picture here I want to show you. I stopped by the business center, but I forgot it was closed on Saturday. But this is a picture in the Rijksmuseum, the third-ranked art museum in the world, in front of the 8th greatest painting ever painted. You can pass that around. It's a picture of about 12 kids in front of the 8th greatest painting ever painted, staring at their phone. And that's what kind of we're up against. My co-author and I have four main concerns about technology. One is the sheer volume of time spent on it. A 1916 study said that kids between 8 and 12 spend about 41 hours a week on screens, and kids between 13 and 16 spend about 60 hours. I flew down here on Thursday, and I got on the plane in Minneapolis, and a kid about 15 was sitting next to me, and he got out his video game and he started playing, and he played from before we took off in Minneapolis till we landed in Orlando, and he played so hard that about, somewhere over Georgia, he was like going like this with his thumb and going like this because he was all cramping up, and he never stopped. So we don't know what that's doing, The second thing that we're concerned about is the actual content of the media. The third thing is interruptions to the focus of life. Interruptions to the focus of life are huge. There is a huge uptick in attention deficit, and it makes sense. I want you to, you hear stats all the time, but I really want you to think about this. Most kids get or receive about 3,400 texts a month. Sprint says that most of those texts are read on an average of 5 seconds after they come in. Now think of the ramifications of that. That basically means that kids are sitting right next to their phone waiting for a text to come in all the time. It seems like it'd be really hard. One of the reasons that, 10 years ago, I'm going to jump it, 10 years ago, I had parents coming in and say, can you give us some help? I'm really concerned about my kids' screen time and smartphone, and they seem like they're addicted. Now, 10 years later, I have kids coming in and say, I can't talk to mom, she's always on her phone. So this is spreading through our culture. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think we have to do something. And whatever we do, it's going to be countercultural. You guys that raised your hand that you have kids, your kids are not going to appreciate you trying to do something because their friends' parents aren't doing anything usually. So it's an uphill struggle, and it's a lonely struggle. But I want you to understand a little bit about the mechanics as soon as I give you a couple more stats. About 8.5% of Americans from age 8 to 18 would be considered clinically addicted to gaming. There are about 230 million people in the world that play Fortnite regularly. Fortnite is currently the most popular game. 92% of teens look to social media daily, and 24% self-report, it means they admit it, that they're on, quote, almost constantly. That was one of the boxes they could check. The proven emotional effects of screen time these are the proven ones: more moody, restless, irritable. There's about a 60% higher incidence of depression for kids that are on Facebook a lot. Video gamers have markedly lower emotional control and increased aggression. Next area that we're concerned about is the content. And you could summarize that pornography is a $20 billion industry. Most kids, an average, kids are exposed around 8 or 9 for the first time. And the largest consumers of pornography are 15 to 17. The fourth area is cyberbullying. I want to tell you a story, and two stories, and then that's all I want to say about cyberbullying. I had a client. He was a shy, awkward kid. He was 15. His favorite thing to do was deer hunting. He came in and his mom was explaining to me the dilemma. So he's 15 years old. He goes to a school of about 800 kids, a big high school, a big junior high in Minnesota. And one of his friends texts him, "What are you doing?" And for a joke, he sends a picture of his genitalia to his buddy. In about 36 hours, the entire school had a picture of his genitalia, and he was suspended. And he's a very shy kid, and he was absolutely devastated, to the point that he has post-traumatic stress. He did a stupid thing at 15. When I did stupid things at 15, only me and two of my friends saw it. This is a terrible, terrible consequence. So there's more to the story. So the parents come to see me, and he can't get away from it, and there's nicknames for him in the hallway, and they finally decide to change schools. So he withdraws from school. The parents send him to a private school. They drive him 20 minutes every morning. And 5 months later, what do you think happens?
We'll see
The old picture shows up at the new school. And I don't know if that boy will ever recover. That's a boy that did something stupid. But there are also cyberbullying stories with kids that just fell. They just tripped getting off the bus, and their books were all over, and somebody snaps a picture and it's all over school. There's cyberbullying about, a prominent 10th grade couple that they broke up, or something happened and it's not true, or it is true. I don't even know where to go with this. I don't know any more than you guys know. We were not built for this kind of life as people. We were not made that if we tripped and dropped our books on our way to school, that 800 people would see a picture of it. I want to talk about addiction and how it relates to this. So, here's how the brain was supposed to work. Back in the day, for thousands of years, there was this thing called dopamine. And dopamine would be released when we did something that was related to survival. And dopamine released, it's called a bliss, fun, or motivational hormone. It's a chemical in the brain that makes us feel motivated, that makes us feel joy, it makes us feel euphoria at times. And the way our brain was invented by God was that when somebody, when a dad or somebody would go out and shoot a wild boar and that was enough food for a month, he would get a dopamine hit and he would feel like he'd provided for his family. Or somebody in Kansas or Nebraska 150 years ago, when they finally put that lost log on the log pile that would keep them warm all winter, a little bit of dopamine would be released. When some of our relatives passed through Ellis Island, a little dopamine was released because they were getting a new start. It was a new chance to build a new life. And a lot of those people left because there was famine or something in their or oppression in their old country. So here was their chance to start again. They were taking a risk, they were achieving something, and they get a little dopamine hit. Well, somewhere along the way, different strategies were found to feel euphoric without having to achieve anything towards survival. It first started out, with the Incas, with cocoa leaves, was the first thing that we know of. In China, opiates go way, way, way back, but they weren't known generally. The first time that they showed up here was a miracle drug that came out during the Civil War called morphine. And morphine was written up in the New York Times and different periodicals as being a godsend. It was the miracle drug. It was going to change everything. And what happened was it got soldiers so that they could march for 10 more miles with nothing in their stomach. And it got them to be able to get home to their farm after they'd been shot in the leg, but a lot of them became addicted. So people today can still get a natural dopamine euphoric feeling. You hear, not me, but some people after they run a marathon, they feel euphoric. Or sometimes they feel euphoric after some great achievement. But today, the easiest, shortest way to get a euphoric feeling is a chemical. And so in the 60s, most homes started getting televisions. But televisions didn't release dopamine. The reason they didn't release it is because they weren't interactive. We were just watching something. And it turns out that just biologically, until we started interacting with social media, with video games, with Instagram, with texting, with YouTube, that's when dopamine started to be released from these technology things. And that's when the inventors of the video game started to realize. A friend of mine is a techie, and he flew out to California to do some work with a video game company, and they put probes on his head, and they showed him 30 seconds of a video game, and they measured whether his brain had responded in 30 seconds. If it hadn't, they were sending it back to their art department to redo the first 30 seconds of the game. So here's where we are. Any child old enough to have a tablet or a smartphone can get a feel-good boost without accomplishing anything. That's where we're at.
Is there a half-life of any kind to it?
I don't know. Yeah, there certainly is. Unless, he asked if there's a half-life to it. What we don't know is kids that have been using tablets. Kids, my guy I wrote the book with is a top pediatrician. He has kids that are 2 years old that are playing an hour of video games on a tablet in his waiting room waiting to come in to see the doctor. Now, we don't know at 2 years old if anything that's permanent is going to be damaged in their brain. We don't know. Nobody knows where this is headed, but it is scary. We're all familiar with the opioid epidemic. The first year that chemicals have taken more lives than car accidents in our country was last year. And this is all around the same thing. So I want to show you an addiction chart. And I want to show you why people that you might know that use or something will say what they say. So we're going to say that this is your own baseline. That's 0. We'll say this is minus 10, and this is plus 10. And plus 10 is feeling great about something you've done. Minus 10 is feeling like if I stay here too long, I'm not going to want to live. So some kid who's at 0 goes to a party and uses a drug, and he gets a spike up to 3. So he goes home, wakes up the next morning, and instead of feeling 0, he feels minus 0.5. And at minus 0.5, he thinks, man, it'd be fun to have another party next week. So he goes to a party the next week, and maybe they're using stuff a little stronger, so he's up to 4. The next morning he wakes up and he's at -1. Okay. So now he's here. So one of the things that I hear with people that are pot users is it helps me feel better. So if you take this out, and you know, cocaine is like, whoa. I mean, I've talked to people that used heroin and they've said, there is no natural feeling that you can get. I don't care if it's a Beatles concert. I don't care what it is. There's nothing natural you can get that's as high as a heroin fix. You can't get there. So this person is starting to use, and they're going like this. So now we're let's say 2 months into this, and this kid's right here, and he's in my office, and he says, marijuana, Instagram helps me. Well, it does help him, because something other than him is the only way to get back to zero. Now, so when they say that pot or something helps, or even my phone helps, and I've heard this from kids, that's what they're saying. Yeah, it does help. It does help you get out of the hole you're in and back to where you were when you started. And that's the risk that's involved.
What are you implying, how long that bottoming out? Like permanent?
No. So if a person stopped using, they would probably 2 days later get to here, another day later get to here, 5 days later they get to there, and they'd kind of be back to zero, you know, if they go cold turkey. It depends on what drug they're on. But the point is that the same thing to a minor degree is happening with video games particularly, but also any kind of social media. Video games are extremely addictive. There are addiction treatment centers opening up all over China and South Korea. They haven't really hit here, but there are kids that are definitely addicted. And I want to talk about something about video games that a lot of parents don't know, because it confused me for a long time. A really good kid that's getting pretty good grades from a pretty good family is said, you've got 10 minutes, get off your game, you played enough today. You've got homework to do, or we're going to grandma's. And the kid doesn't stop. And mom says, get off the game, I told you, you had 10 minutes, it's been 15. Shut it off now or you're not going to use it for a week. So pretty soon this turns into a full-blown explosion. And what mom doesn't realize is that the way some of the games are designed are that you're playing against other people and you get penalized for jumping off early. So the kid can't tell his mom that, because she would say, well, you can't play a game like that. You can play Candy Crush, or you can play this or that, but there's a lot of things going on in the kid's head that a lot of parents don't know about, including certain games where kids can turn in a Visa card number and buy their way up to different levels and different weapons. So, and then all these games, they have a world championship. Maybe a lot of you guys know about this more than me, but they have a world championship every year, and they rent an arena, and they fill, and 13,000 people come in from all over and play these games. So it's a huge deal, and if you have a loved one that's playing a lot of video games, you need to educate yourself about what's happening. I want to talk about self-esteem. Any questions so far?
You mentioned TV. We were a TV generation, so
Right.
There were some of us. I didn't because I was on a farm, but watched a lot of TV.
Right.
Have they had any studies on what that has done? Have they correlated anything with just non-stimulated but passive watching, and how that's affected us? That's number one question. Second one is, currency traders are like on constant call. You know, I've known they can only do it for so long a time.
Right.
Have any similar things to what we're experiencing now been studied?
Not that I know of. But I know currency traders and their nerves are frazzled after a while. So anything that interrupts us constantly isn't good for us because it actually shortens over time our focus, and we're getting. I'll tell you, you guys can research this if you want, but anybody you know that brags about their ability to multitask is really ignorant.
Yeah.
Multitasking makes us stupider.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that think that that's not true, and they pride themselves in being great at multitasking, but just read some, I quoted some in the book here, but just read any study, and it shows over and over and over that the more things you have going on at once, the shallower your thoughts are. So, self-esteem. Webster's describes esteem as having high value or great regard for something. So self-esteem is you having high value and great regard for yourself. Now right here in the process of thinking in our culture is what I call the great myth. And the great myth is this. Others' esteem plus performance equals self-esteem. Now, this was the predominant thought in the 80s and in the 90s. And it manifested itself with books and seminars and work on what they called affirmation. There was a book called 1001 Ways to Affirm Your Kid. 20 years later, what we found is that others' esteem didn't lead to self-esteem. It led to an addiction to others' esteem. So the only relationship between others' esteem is the relationship between aspirin and a headache. Does aspirin have any relationship to a headache? I guess you could say yeah. Takes the pain away. Others' esteem takes the pain of low self-esteem away temporarily. So, self-esteem is best measured when you're alone, when you're not with your friends, when your plans have failed. So if you like yourself, if you hold yourself in high regard when other peoples are not esteeming you and your last 3 things you worked on have failed, then you have self-esteem. So I want to talk a little bit about where self-esteem comes from. Number one, I'm going to spend 30 seconds on this. I've never met anybody with self-esteem that somebody didn't love. Everybody, it seems like, needs to be loved by at least one person to love themselves. And I don't know why that is, it just is. But the good news is almost everybody I've met, somebody does love. So that's not a big issue. Even kids that are struggling with terrible self-esteem over and over and over, even adopted kids. Do you know your parents love you? Overwhelmingly. Overwhelmingly, the answer is yes, I know that. So that's not a big problem. The second thing is accurate self-assessment. And that's hard. We talked a little bit about that this morning, but self-esteem, an aspect of self-esteem is accurate self-assessment. Because what happens is, it's too easy to turn away from a self that we don't understand. If we don't know who we are, we don't hold tightly to that. And to have self-esteem, self-love, self-regard, we have to have something we can hold on to. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Does high self-esteem, and it's momentary, right? Nobody sits like this, it's not robotic. But in those moments when you have high self-esteem, do you get the same dopamine fix? To where you could then be using other self-esteem to get that fix and have an addictive dependency?
No, there's no dopamine fix with self-esteem. Self-esteem is just whether you regard yourself highly, whether you feel like you have value, that somebody that loved you isn't wrong.
Do you ever then, absent the dopamine, do you still find people with low self-esteem almost dependent, or maybe addicted is a loaded word, but really seeking the others?
Yes.
A less fulfilling, kind of like the pattern you did where it's less fulfilling each time, so you need more
Yeah,
times?
because low self-esteem is the headache, and they will go to either the euphoria of a dopamine fix, or they'll go to the aspirin of others' esteem. It's just a natural kind of progression. That's where you want to go. I want somebody, when I feel bad about myself, I want somebody to tell me I'm great. We talked about shame in the last breakout. And if I can't find somebody to tell me I'm great, I'm going to check my Instagram and see what my friends are doing. Because that gives you just a little bit. Even Instagram, even texting gives you just a little bit. It feels like you're in on what's happening. Number 2 was accurate self-assessment. I recently had a kid as a client. I say, at my age, I say a kid, I'm sorry. When somebody's 28, I shouldn't do that. A young man come in, and he was called by his boss to his boss's office, and he thought he was going to get a promotion. And when he got there, he was fired. Now, I thought that was a great example of not having an accurate self-assessment. How could you be so wrong about how you're doing? But more and more and more kids are wrong because that has not been developed, the ability to accurately self-assess. And it makes sense why you can't self-assess accurately. A lot of these kids got participation trophies, and they got in AP classes. They were told that they were wonderful. I've seen all kinds of crazy kind of affirmations in little grade schools that these kids are. I remember walking even in the early 90s, walking by my son's second grade classroom, and the teacher's in there, and I was just at school for something else, and every one of you is special. And so we're going to talk about that in a minute. The third thing is resilience. You have to have resilience to have good self-esteem because we're going to fail. And failing is not everybody fails, but failing by definition is usually, let me explain it this way. If you're the smartest person in your math class in high school, chances are you're going to go to MIT, and when you get to MIT, you're going to be average. So if you're brilliant as an inventor, you're going to invent more complex things, and eventually you're going to invent something that fails. So resilience is really important. It's great to see in kids. My son, our place up in Canada is a very treacherous lake. It's about 100 miles long, and it has 1,200 islands on it. And my son took our boat out, and it was one of the first times. And he was gone for about 40 minutes, and he came back with a little trolling motor, and he'd hit a rock, and he was devastated. And the boat was insured and all that, but he couldn't forgive himself. And I watched his process day after day after day of accepting the fact that he'd hit a rock, that he wasn't paying attention, that he misread the map, and gaining the courage to go out again, to take his friends, to bring a different map, to study the map at night. And that's resilience. It's getting back on the horse that bucked you off.
Hey Michael, how do you help guide that in younger children? I mean, I speak for a 7-year-old who's very good in sports, comes naturally, great. But as soon as because he can do so many things easily and well and gets praised for them, frankly, when he can't do something, small math problem, whatever it is, it's over. Mentally, he shuts down. I'm out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I struggle with that. Kind of give it some slack because he's 6 and 7 years old, but also I struggle with how do I teach? How do I redirect him to say it's okay? Let's do it together. I don't know if you have ideas on that.
Well, I'm not going to get into it, but in my book there's a chapter called The Two Things. And I talk about every kid has two things they most need to work on. And for some kids that are like that, one of the two things has to be your admiration of how they failed rather than how they succeeded. So you have to become countercultural. One of my sons, true story, his junior year of high school, my wife and I offered him $50 to not study for finals. Because he was taking school way too serious. I heard him on the phone one day and his buddies asked him to come down to this high school and play touch football, and he said, no, I have to study, and he already knew everything that he needed to study for. So our two things was countercultural. And for you, it's so, so powerful to just watch all the times for everything that he did. If he played baseball, last game you had 3 hits, but I was more impressed with your attitude when you struck out today. And you just kind of start building that, and you start noticing, because kids are getting feedback from us all the time on what lights up our eyes, what we value, what we're concerned about. And so if you start with him and you say, everybody noticed how many points you scored, but what impressed me was your attitude when you had a turnover, if it's a basketball game. And you start doing that, and over years the kid starts buying into that wow, there are things happening on other levels here. So that's how I would answer that. So achievement is the fourth requirement for self-esteem. I wish achievement wasn't, because what I wish was true was that a kid with really bad self-esteem could go to a counseling group and spill his guts and share in group and start feeling better about himself. But my experience tells me that doesn't happen unless there's an achievement. And that's why the best teenage treatment programs, I think, are wilderness programs, because kids start feeling like, wow, none of my buddies back home have ever slept out under the stars when there's coyotes nearby, or especially you take kids hunting. Or one of the biggest things that I've seen because I'm a pilot, I hang out at an airport, and kids that are 16 or 17 that are working on their pilot's license, it's a tremendous achievement, and it really boosts their self-esteem. But the achievement could be anything.
I was going to say that as an Eagle Scout, once and always, that is a terrific organization within that, although I know there's several that are similar to that.
Right.
Survival.
So I want to talk about the fifth one, which is the myth of specialness. I don't know what's happened with our family, with our country, but we've certainly lost lost sight of the data. There actually is a definition of exceptional and a definition of normal. And normal is 2 standard deviations from the mean, which means basically that on the positive side of a graph, 2 standard deviations is 97.6%. So 2.3% of the population in any measurable trait is exceptional. Anybody under that is normal. Height, weight, intelligence, any measurable trait. So there actually is a definition of exceptional, but we've thrown that out the window. And we've thrown it out to our detriment. If you ever talk to, which I do sometimes, talk to a young mom or dad who has a child coming and they're in the 3rd trimester, and you say, do you know if it's a boy or a girl? And they say, I don't care, as long as it's healthy and normal. That's the last time you'll probably ever hear that couple be okay with their child being normal. Shortly after he's born, it isn't good to be normal. And I have counseled, my specialty in my practice is teenagers. And I have teenagers come in over and over and over, and the worst insult that I could give, I could call them lazy, I could call them losers. The worst insult that I could give them is that they're normal. And that's what's happened with our culture because we've become preoccupied. I said this in the book, and I just loved it as kind of on the day in our country when exceptional becomes expected, being normal will become defective. And we've reached that day. There is something really, really beautiful about a normal kid. I have 3 natural kids. I had 13 foster kids. My natural kids are wonderful kids. They're very successful. They're hardworking. Not one of my 3 kids is exceptional in any measurable trait. I was giving a talk one time at a church, and I said that sentence. And a guy gasped, and he said from the back, but you don't tell them that, do you? I said, yeah, I've told them that since they were 4. I told them you're wonderful, but you're not exceptional. Wonderful is light, exceptional is heavy. I don't know any one thing that would be more horrible or more stressful than a 14 or 15-year-old growing up in an environment where what counts as being exceptional, they're told they're exceptional and they're really normal. How could you ever win that? So, I want to touch about just one other thing here, because we're just kind of running out of time. I wish I had more time, but I'll stick around if you want to talk. But I want to talk about so of the 5 things, and I want to review those. There are being loved, accurate self-image, resilience, achievement, and the myth of specialness. Video games and technology affect 3 of those. It doesn't really affect most kids that are into video games and technology and Instagram, feel that they're loved, and actually most of them are resilient. But they feel a need to be special. Most of their achievements are virtual achievements, so they're ungratifying. You could play 600 hours of a video game and move to level 5, and in the real world, you haven't accomplished anything. You've only accomplished something in cyberspace, a virtual achievement. Last thing I want to do is just talk about addiction and what to do in your family. This is just my ideas. Can't find where my notes are here. But if you feel like your family may be addicted, a couple things to watch for. One, I don't care how many hours you're on your phone or on a video game. The big thing is what happens when you're off. So everybody in your family should be comfortable with being off, and the only way to know that is to, I recommend that you just have as a family policy that we use no technology or no Facebook, Instagram, texting, anything like that on Tuesdays. And just to keep that feeling natural. Family vacations, put your phones away. Watch out for kids that overreact to having their phone shut down. Watch out for yourself if you overreact. Here's the key signs that somebody in your family could be addicted. They're preoccupied with technology. Their need to use is increasing all the time. They've promised to cut back and they're unsuccessful. They're restless, moody, or depressed or irritable when they're not near their phone. They stay on longer than they intended. I'm just going to be on for 15 minutes and they're on for 40. It's affecting their relationships. And they use screen time to escape. Well, I always wondered why that's on there, because everybody that uses screen time, I use screen time to escape. I just go on YouTube at night just to wind down. I don't think that's a big deal because I can easily go without going on YouTube. So anyway, we didn't have a lot of time here, 45 minutes, big topics, but I'm going to stick around and answer any questions you have, but this is the time that we're supposed to be done, so I'm going to informally end it.